An arrogant tech billionaire thought he could use Mandarin to humiliate a waitress with zero consequences. He didn't know she understood every word. Worse for him, his billion-dollar merger was already imploding due to a communication breakdown no expert in the room could fix. Within the hour, the woman he looked down upon would become his empire's only lifeline and expose a truth that would leave a room full of executives speechless. On a cool spring evening in Palo Alto, a sleek black luxury sedan pulled up to Silicon Valley's most exclusive restaurant. Ethan Caldwell stepped out, adjusting his custom-tailored suit. At 42, Ethan was the CEO of Nexus Quantum Systems, a $12 billion AI powerhouse. The media called him a visionary genius. Tonight, he was here to close the biggest deal of his life. After 18 months of grueling negotiations, Nexus was finalizing a massive AI infrastructure merger with a powerful Asian tech conglomerate. It was a deal meant to secure Ethan's global dominance for the next decade. For him, failure wasn't an option. The restaurant's private dining room was meticulously arranged to radiate success. Yet, the moment Ethan walked in, his attitude turned the elegant setting into a hostile corporate command center. He snapped his fingers impatiently, tossing his leather binder onto the table, and barked at his assistant. "The temperature is 2 degrees over spec. Fix it. I'm not paying thousands to sit in a sauna." He aggressively shoved a menu aside, complained about the fork placement, and snapped at a tech hand. To Ethan, people weren't associates, they were tools. Across the room, 28-year-old Sophia Bennett held a tray of drinks with absolute poise. She had worked here for 2 years, accustomed to ultra-wealthy clients looking right through her. Sophia preferred it that way. While executives buzzed about market capture, she moved like a shadow, her quiet eyes recording everything. Soon, the Chinese delegation arrived, led by Li Wei, a legendary negotiator who valued character just as much as a balance sheet. He bowed politely to everyone, even smiling at Sophia as she took his coat. Ethan, however, went straight for the throat with numbers. He held court, talking down to the room about projected growth and plans to choke out the competition. His subtext was clear: "I am the apex predator here." Mr. Li listened patiently, but subtle cracks began to show. His smiles grew sparse. When Sophia stepped forward to pour wine, Ethan rudely waved her off, nearly splattering the pristine tablecloth. A few Chinese executives exchanged sharp glances. Standing close enough, Sophia caught a low-toned murmur in Mandarin from Mr. Li's chief aide. "This man's arrogance is toxic. Partnering with someone who treats subordinates like garbage is a liability. He will stab us in the back." Sophia's eyes flickered for a fraction of a second, but she instantly regained her professional calm and stepped back into the shadows. Ethan's advisors were sweating, sensing the shift in the room. But Ethan was blind, drunk on his own hype. Fully convinced the contract was in his pocket, he was about to make a fatal mistake. A calculated linguistic insult he thought nobody could decode, lighting the fuse on a ticking time bomb. Most people would forget a waitress within seconds. Ethan was about to remember this one for the rest of his career. The atmosphere inside the private dining room continued to tighten with every passing minute. What had begun as a celebration of opportunity was slowly becoming a test of patience. Ethan Caldwell remained unaware of the shift. Seated at the head of the table, he spoke with the confidence of a man who believed the outcome had already been decided. He interrupted advisors, corrected minor details that nobody else considered important, and frequently redirected conversations back toward his own achievements. Around him, members of the Chinese delegation listened politely, but the warmth that had greeted the evening was fading. Li Wei maintained a composed expression, yet his attention increasingly drifted away from financial projections and toward Ethan's behavior. In his experience, successful partnerships depended on trust long before contracts were signed. Numbers could be negotiated. Character could not. Meanwhile, Sophia Bennett continued serving the room with quiet professionalism. She refilled water glasses, delivered appetizers, and cleared plates without drawing attention to herself. Like many service professionals, she had learned how to become nearly invisible in rooms occupied by powerful people. Yet invisibility often came with a unique advantage. She noticed the uncomfortable glances exchanged between delegates. She noticed advisors whispering among themselves. Most importantly, she noticed the growing frustration behind Li Wei's calm demeanor. The turning point arrived during the main course. One of Ethan's assistants had requested a specific presentation file containing updated infrastructure projections. The file had been delayed because of a technical issue at the office. Already irritated by the slow pace of negotiations, Ethan demanded immediate answers. At that exact moment, Sophia approached the table carrying a replacement drink for one of the guests. A misunderstanding occurred regarding where the beverage should be placed. It was a small mistake, the kind that happened thousands of times each day in restaurants across America. Under normal circumstances, nobody would have remembered it. Ethan, however, seized the moment as an outlet for his frustration. He sharply criticized Sophia in front of everyone at the table. His voice was not loud enough to disturb the rest of the restaurant, but it carried enough force to freeze the room. Sophia apologized professionally and attempted to correct the situation. Instead of moving on, Ethan continued. Believing he was being clever, he switched into Mandarin. With a faint smile, he made dismissive remarks about her intelligence and competence, confident that she could not understand what he was saying. A few of his American colleagues laughed nervously. Sophia's expression never changed. She simply nodded and continued her work. Across the table, several members of the Chinese delegation immediately became uncomfortable. Their reactions were subtle but unmistakable. One executive lowered his gaze. Another stopped taking notes. Li Wei sat silently for several seconds before setting down his glass. The issue was no longer a misplaced drink. The issue was respect. Ethan mistook the silence for agreement and returned his attention to the merger discussion. What he failed to realize was that the conversation had already changed. Until that moment, Li Wei began questioning whether a partnership with Nexus Quantum Systems was worth pursuing at all. And as doubts quietly spread through the delegation, the future of the billion-dollar merger suddenly became far less certain than Ethan imagined. Believing nobody around him would understand, Ethan switched to Mandarin and delivered a humiliating remark. The only problem was that the person he was mocking understood every word. The moment Ethan switched languages, he believed he had found privacy. Instead, he had unknowingly revealed the biggest weakness in the room. The discussion attempted to move forward, but the energy in the room had changed in a way that no presentation slide could repair. Ethan Caldwell continued speaking about projected growth, international expansion, and the future of artificial intelligence infrastructure, yet his words seemed to drift across the table without making an impact. Li Wei listened politely, but his attention was elsewhere. The incident with Sophia had revealed something more important than financial forecasts. It had revealed character. Several members of the delegation exchanged brief comments in Mandarin while reviewing technical documents connected to the merger. Ethan noticed the conversation but assumed everything remained under control. After all, he had assembled a team of consultants, translators, and software systems specifically designed to prevent communication failures. Unfortunately, the confidence he placed in technology was about to become a problem. As negotiations shifted into the most critical phase of the evening, a disagreement emerged regarding the deployment structure of a new artificial intelligence infrastructure platform. The issue involved complex terminology, layered technical concepts, and cultural business expectations that extended far beyond literal translation. Ethan's translation software converted every word accurately, but accuracy alone was not enough. The meaning behind the words began to disappear. A phrase intended to describe a collaborative framework was interpreted as an attempt to impose control. A statement about long-term partnership sounded like a demand for compliance. The misunderstanding grew with each exchange. Advisors started whispering among themselves. The translators reviewed their notes repeatedly. Nobody could identify exactly where communication had broken down. Li Wei's expression became increasingly serious. One member of his team quietly closed a folder containing preliminary agreement documents. Another stopped participating in the discussion altogether. The signs were subtle, but they pointed toward the same conclusion. The merger was drifting toward failure. Ethan sensed resistance and responded the only way he knew how. He pushed harder. He repeated numbers. He emphasized market opportunities. He insisted that the proposal was objectively beneficial for everyone involved. Yet the more he spoke, the wider the gap became. What Ethan saw as leadership, others increasingly viewed as arrogance. Across the room, Sophia watched the exchange unfold while organizing empty glasses near a service station. At first, she remained focused on her responsibilities. Then she noticed a specific technical term repeated several times during the conversation. A second phrase followed, then a third. The problem became immediately obvious to her. The software was translating the vocabulary correctly, but completely missing the cultural and strategic context surrounding it. What one side intended as cooperation was being interpreted by the other side as domination. The entire conflict was built on misunderstanding. Sophia paused. She knew exactly why the negotiation was collapsing. More importantly, she knew how to fix it. Still, stepping into a room filled with billion-dollar executives was not a decision she could make lightly. Ethan certainly had no interest in hearing from someone he had already dismissed. Yet as the discussion continued deteriorating, even the most expensive experts at the table seemed powerless to stop it. Li Wei finally leaned back in his chair and exchanged a look with one of his senior colleagues. It was not a look of confusion. It was a look of disappointment. At that moment, Sophia realized that if nobody intervened soon, the opportunity that had taken 18 months to build would disappear before the night was over. As the negotiations spiraled toward disaster, Sophia finally recognized the real problem. The merger was not failing because of money, technology, or strategy. It was failing because nobody understood what the other side truly meant. Sophia knew exactly why the merger was collapsing. The real question was whether helping the man who had just humiliated her was worth the risk. The room remained locked in an uncomfortable silence. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The tension that had slowly built throughout the evening now felt impossible to ignore. Sophia knew exactly what had gone wrong. The translation software was technically accurate, but culturally disastrous. For several seconds, she considered staying silent. Intervening could cost her job. The executive who had just mocked her clearly did not want her opinion. Yet as she looked around the room, she realized something bigger was happening. A misunderstanding was about to destroy months of work for people on both sides of the table. Ethan Caldwell looked around the table searching for a way to regain control, but every strategy he normally relied upon seemed ineffective. Numbers were no longer persuading anyone. Presentations were no longer helping. Even the team of consultants he had assembled appeared uncertain about what to do next. Across from him, Li Wei reviewed a document without saying a word. The disappointment on his face was more concerning than anger would have been. Anger could be negotiated. Disappointment often meant a decision had already been made. Near the service station, Sophia Bennett took a slow breath. She understood the risk of getting involved. This was not her meeting. These were not her clients. Yet she also knew that a misunderstanding was about to destroy an opportunity worth billions of dollars. More importantly, she knew that neither side actually wanted the negotiation to fail. They simply could not see the source of the problem. After a moment of careful consideration, Sophia walked toward the table. Several executives looked surprised as she approached. Ethan noticed her immediately and frowned. In his mind, the last thing the room needed was another interruption. Before he could dismiss her, Sophia spoke calmly and respectfully. She apologized for intruding and asked whether she could clarify a small point regarding the discussion. The request alone surprised everyone. Ethan looked annoyed. One of his advisors appeared confused. Li Wei raised an eyebrow with quiet curiosity. Then Sophia turned toward the Chinese delegation and began speaking. The room froze. Her Mandarin was not basic. It was not conversational. It was fluent, sophisticated, and remarkably precise. The executives who had spent the evening struggling through technical translations immediately focused their attention on her. She explained that the disagreement was not about infrastructure deployment at all. It was about how certain strategic terms had been interpreted. A phrase intended to communicate partnership had been understood as a demand for control. Another phrase designed to emphasize collaboration had unintentionally suggested a loss of independence. As she continued, she carefully translated not only the words, but also the cultural expectations behind them. The distinction was subtle, yet critical. Suddenly, the confusion that had dominated the evening began to make sense. Members of the delegation exchanged surprised looks. Several nodded in agreement. Li Wei listened closely before responding in Mandarin. Sophia answered immediately. Their conversation continued for several minutes. Advisors who had been completely lost only moments earlier now watched in disbelief as the misunderstanding unraveled piece by piece. Ethan sat silently. It was the exact moment Ethan realized he was no longer the center of gravity in the room. The woman he had publicly criticized was now leading the most important conversation in the room. What surprised him even more was the confidence with which she navigated highly technical concepts. She understood both the language and the business implications behind it. There was no hesitation in her explanations, no uncertainty, no attempt to impress anyone. She simply focused on solving the problem. Gradually, the atmosphere began to change. Frustration gave way to curiosity. Curiosity evolved into cooperation. The walls that had separated both sides throughout the evening started to disappear. And as Sophia continued bridging the gap between two powerful groups, Ethan began realizing something that made him deeply uncomfortable. The future of the merger no longer depended on him. It depended entirely on the waitress he had assumed knew nothing. Then Sophia turned toward the delegation and spoke in flawless Mandarin. The room was impressed by Sophia's fluency. Li Wei was not impressed yet. He wanted proof that she understood more than just the language. For the next several minutes, the negotiation moved in a direction that had seemed impossible less than an hour earlier. The tension that had dominated the room began to ease as Sophia carefully translated not only the language being spoken, but also the intentions behind it. Whenever a phrase risked creating confusion, she provided the context necessary for both sides to understand each other clearly. The effect was immediate. Questions that had previously led to frustration now produced thoughtful discussion. Concerns that had appeared impossible to resolve suddenly revealed practical solutions. Li Wei's delegation became noticeably more engaged, and genuine collaboration returned to the table. Ethan Caldwell watched the transformation unfold with growing disbelief. His advisors were equally stunned. The same experts who had spent hours attempting to repair the communication breakdown were now taking notes while a waitress guided the conversation. Yet what impressed the delegation most was not Sophia's fluency. It was her professionalism. She never drew attention to herself. She never referenced the insult Ethan had directed at her earlier. She never attempted to embarrass anyone. Her sole focus remained on helping both sides reach a mutual understanding. That quiet confidence earned respect faster than any title could have. As the discussion progressed, Li Wei began addressing certain questions directly to Sophia. Li Wei listened carefully before asking a question that immediately changed the atmosphere. Speaking entirely in Mandarin, he challenged Sophia to explain the concern that his delegation had been struggling to express all evening. The question was not about technology. It was about trust. For a brief moment, the room became silent again. Sophia answered without hesitation. She explained that the delegation was not worried about infrastructure deployment itself. They were worried about becoming dependent on a system they could not fully influence in the future. What Ethan's team viewed as efficiency, the delegation viewed as vulnerability. As she continued, several members of the delegation exchanged surprised looks. Someone had accurately identified the concern beneath the negotiation. Li Wei studied her for several seconds before smiling. "You did not learn Mandarin in a classroom alone," he said. Sophia hesitated before admitting that she had spent 2 years studying international relations in Beijing before family circumstances forced her to return home. The revelation surprised everyone at the table, including Ethan. He asked for clarification regarding long-term governance structures, infrastructure deployment expectations, and strategic partnership language. Each time, she responded with precision and balance, ensuring that neither side felt dismissed or misunderstood. The atmosphere continued improving until even the most skeptical executives recognized that the merger was alive again. Ethan, however, found himself facing a different problem. Every success achieved during the negotiation highlighted his earlier failure. He could no longer ignore the contrast between his behavior and Sophia's. While he had relied on status, she relied on competence. While he had attempted to control the room through authority, she had earned influence through understanding. The realization was deeply uncomfortable. By the end of the evening, the final concerns had been addressed. Documents were reviewed one last time. Advisors exchanged relieved smiles. Then Li Wei closed his folder and looked across the table. For several seconds, the room remained silent. Finally, he spoke. Through Sophia's translation, he explained that successful partnerships require more than technology, capital, or ambition. They require respect. He acknowledged the value of the agreement but emphasized that the evening had nearly ended very differently. Had the misunderstanding remained unresolved, the merger would have collapsed. Several members of the delegation nodded in agreement. Then Li Wei did something Ethan never expected. Instead of thanking the executives responsible for the deal, he stood and expressed his gratitude directly to Sophia. One by one, members of the delegation followed his lead. The room erupted in polite applause. Ethan sat motionless. The merger he had spent 18 months pursuing had finally been secured, yet everyone understood who had truly saved it. As the applause faded, Ethan slowly rose from his chair. For perhaps the first time in years, he found himself standing in a room where money, influence, and reputation offered no advantage at all. After listening to her explanation, Li Wei slowly nodded. It was the first sign that the merger might actually survive the night. In less than 10 minutes, the waitress Ethan had insulted became the most important person in the negotiation. The applause gradually faded, but the impact of the moment remained. Conversations resumed around the room, yet the center of attention had quietly shifted. For most of the evening, Ethan Caldwell had been the unquestioned authority at the table. Now he found himself struggling to process how quickly that reality had changed. The merger had been saved, the delegation was satisfied, and the future of Nexus Quantum Systems looked brighter than it had only an hour earlier. Yet none of those victories felt entirely his. As executives exchanged business cards and discussed implementation timelines, Ethan watched Sophia Bennett prepare to return to her normal responsibilities. There was no sign of triumph in her expression, no attempt to capitalize on the attention she had received. She simply resumed her work with the same calm professionalism she had displayed throughout the evening. The contrast was impossible to ignore. One of Ethan's senior advisors approached him quietly and admitted that the negotiation would almost certainly have failed without her intervention. Another executive agreed. Even members of Ethan's own team appeared more impressed by Sophia's performance than by the merger itself. For a man accustomed to controlling every narrative in the room, the realization was deeply unsettling. Across the dining area, Li Wei continued speaking with several members of his delegation. Before leaving, he approached Sophia once more and thanked her personally. Through a brief conversation in Mandarin, he expressed admiration not only for her language skills, but also for her understanding of cultural nuance. He explained that fluency alone would not have solved the problem. What impressed him was her ability to understand intent, respect, and trust. Sophia responded modestly, insisting that she had simply helped clarify a misunderstanding. Li Wei smiled and replied that the most valuable people are often the ones who never feel the need to advertise their value. Ethan overheard enough of the exchange to feel a growing sense of discomfort. For years, he had built his career around demonstrating expertise, projecting confidence, and proving his importance. Yet the person who had earned the greatest respect in the room had done none of those things. Eventually, as guests began preparing to leave, Ethan walked toward Sophia. Several employees nearby noticed immediately. The memory of his earlier behavior still lingered in everyone's mind. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Ethan was not accustomed to situations where money could not instantly solve a problem. He reached into his jacket and offered what he believed was a generous financial reward. In his mind, it was both a thank you and an apology. Sophia looked at the offer for a second before politely declining. The response caught Ethan completely off guard. Most people accepted opportunities connected to his wealth without hesitation. Sophia simply smiled and explained that the evening had never been about money. The misunderstanding, she said, had not been caused by a lack of resources. It had been caused by assumptions. She then returned to clearing the table while Ethan stood silently beside her, realizing that for perhaps the first time in his professional life, he was being taught a lesson by someone he had completely underestimated. When the final agreement was secured, the delegates did not thank Ethan first. They stood and thanked Sophia. Ethan had saved his company, but he had lost something far more valuable in the process: the illusion that he was always the smartest person in the room. After Sophia's words, the conversation ended, but the lesson did not. Ethan remained standing beside the table long after she returned to work. Around him, the private dining room was gradually returning to normal. Staff members cleared dishes, executives reviewed final documents, and guests prepared for departure. Yet Ethan found himself paying attention to details he would normally ignore. Only then did Ethan realize how smoothly the restaurant operated because of the people whose names most customers never cared to learn. He noticed the professionalism required to anticipate needs before they were spoken aloud. He noticed the patience it took to remain composed around demanding personalities. The observations were uncomfortable because they challenged assumptions he had carried for years. As the room emptied, several members of his leadership team gathered near the exit. Their mood was celebratory. The merger had survived. Billions of dollars in future opportunities had been protected. Yet the conversations sounded different from what Ethan expected. Instead of discussing his leadership, they discussed Sophia's intervention. One executive admitted that he had completely missed the source of the misunderstanding. Another confessed that the translation software they trusted had been inadequate for handling cultural nuance. A third quietly remarked that the most valuable contribution of the night had come from someone who was never invited to the negotiation. None of the comments were intended as criticism, but Ethan felt their impact nonetheless. Meanwhile, Li Wei remained behind for a few final moments before leaving. As he prepared to depart, he approached Ethan directly. The two men exchanged polite remarks about implementation schedules and future cooperation. Then Li Wei paused. His expression remained professional, but his words carried unusual weight. He explained that business relationships are often tested long before contracts are signed. In many cultures, he said, people reveal their true priorities through the way they treat individuals who appear to have no power. Wealth, education, and success are easy to display. Respect is harder. Ethan listened without interruption. Li Wei continued by admitting that he had seriously considered ending negotiations earlier that evening. Not because of financial concerns, but because he questioned whether a partnership built on arrogance could survive future challenges. The only reason he changed his mind was because someone unexpectedly demonstrated the humility and understanding that had been missing from the discussion. With that, he thanked Ethan for the evening and left the restaurant. The words stayed with Ethan long after the delegation disappeared into waiting vehicles outside. For years he had believed that success came from being the smartest person in the room. Tonight had exposed a different reality. The smartest person in the room had not demanded recognition, occupied the largest chair, or delivered the longest presentation. She had quietly solved a problem nobody else could solve. Across the dining area, Sophia finished organizing the final table settings before preparing to end her shift. She appeared exactly as she had at the beginning of the evening, calm and focused. Yet in Ethan's mind, everything had changed. The merger was secure, but a different question now occupied his thoughts. He no longer wondered how close he had come to losing the deal. He wondered how many other talented people he had overlooked throughout his career simply because he never took the time to see them. Certain that money could repair the damage, Ethan offered Sophia a generous reward. Her response left him speechless. Success was supposed to feel satisfying. Yet days after securing the biggest merger of his career, Ethan could think about only one conversation. The following morning, Ethan Caldwell arrived at the headquarters of Nexus Quantum Systems earlier than usual. The glass tower overlooking Silicon Valley looked exactly as it had the day before, yet something felt different. For years, he had entered the building with absolute certainty. Every decision, every meeting, and every interaction reinforced the belief that success was primarily the result of intelligence, discipline, and relentless ambition. After the events of the previous evening, that certainty had begun to crack. Throughout the day, preparations for the newly secured merger accelerated. Legal teams reviewed final documentation. Engineers coordinated implementation schedules. Investors celebrated the announcement that would soon make headlines across the technology industry. The financial implications were enormous. Analysts projected billions of dollars in future growth. News outlets praised Ethan's leadership. Shareholders applauded the company's strategic vision. Yet behind every congratulatory message, Ethan found himself thinking about the same person. While others focused on the merger, he could not stop thinking about the waitress who had prevented its collapse. Several times he considered dismissing the experience as an unusual exception. Perhaps she had simply been in the right place at the right time. Perhaps the situation had been exaggerated by stress. But the more he examined the events objectively, the less convincing those explanations became. The truth was unavoidable. The merger existed because Sophia Bennett had recognized a problem that an entire room of highly paid professionals had failed to solve. Later that afternoon, Ethan requested a private review of the negotiation recordings and meeting summaries. He wanted to understand exactly where communication had broken down. As analysts replayed portions of the discussion, a pattern emerged. The translation software had processed vocabulary correctly, but it repeatedly failed to capture cultural context, implied meaning, and strategic nuance. The system had performed as designed. The problem was that human communication involved far more than direct translation. Ethan listened carefully and realized something unsettling. He had invested millions of dollars in technology designed to connect people, yet he had nearly destroyed a partnership because he failed to understand people himself. That realization followed him throughout the week. Meanwhile, news of the successful merger spread rapidly through business circles. Industry leaders praised the agreement as one of the most significant technology partnerships of the decade. During interviews, Ethan found himself answering questions about innovation, leadership, and global strategy. At that moment, he spoke less about himself. Instead, he emphasized the importance of listening, cultural understanding, and diverse perspectives. Some reporters noticed the shift. Employees noticed it as well. The change was subtle but real. A few days later, Ethan returned to the same restaurant. He did not arrive with investors or advisors. There were no presentations, negotiations, or cameras. He simply requested a table and waited. When Sophia eventually appeared during her shift, she seemed surprised to see him. Ethan stood and greeted her respectfully. The interaction was completely different from their first encounter. This time there was no arrogance, no impatience, and no assumption that status mattered more than character. They spoke briefly. Ethan admitted that the events of the merger had forced him to reconsider many of his beliefs about leadership. Sophia listened politely. When he thanked her again, she accepted the gratitude but reminded him that lessons only matter when they change future actions. Ethan nodded because he understood exactly what she meant. That was when Ethan realized he was not thinking about the next billion-dollar opportunity. He was thinking about the kind of person he wanted to become after finding success. As Sophia returned to work, she left Ethan with a challenge he could not ignore. The real test was not whether he had learned the lesson. The real test was whether he would change. Nearly a year later, one ordinary evening in a restaurant still followed Ethan wherever he went. Over the months that followed, the merger transformed Nexus Quantum Systems exactly as analysts had predicted. New international partnerships emerged, infrastructure projects expanded across multiple markets, and the company's valuation climbed higher than ever before. To outside observers, the story appeared simple. A successful technology executive had secured a historic agreement and strengthened his position as one of Silicon Valley's most influential leaders. Yet the people closest to Ethan Caldwell understood that a different transformation had taken place behind the scenes. The change was not visible in stock prices, quarterly reports, or financial headlines. It appeared in meeting rooms, employee interactions, and daily decisions. Ethan began spending more time listening than speaking. He encouraged managers to seek input from employees at every level of the organization. Internal training programs expanded to include cultural intelligence, communication skills, and leadership development. Most importantly, he stopped assuming that expertise could be identified solely through titles, resumes, or status. The lesson had been too expensive to ignore. During one company-wide meeting, Ethan shared a story with thousands of employees. He did not mention every detail, but he openly admitted that one of the most important business victories of his career had nearly become one of his greatest failures because he underestimated someone. The room grew silent as employees listened. Many had never heard a public admission of vulnerability from him before. Instead of portraying himself as the hero, he spoke about the dangers of arrogance and the importance of recognizing talent wherever it exists. The response was immediate. Employees who had previously felt overlooked began contributing ideas more confidently. Teams became more collaborative. Several innovations that eventually generated significant revenue originated from individuals whose perspectives might once have been ignored. The impact extended far beyond a single merger. Meanwhile, Sophia Bennett continued living much as she always had. She remained grounded, focused, and largely uninterested in attention. Although she received several professional opportunities following the events at the restaurant, she approached each decision carefully. What mattered most to her was not prestige, but purpose. From time to time, she and Ethan crossed paths at community events, business functions, and leadership discussions. Their conversations were always respectful. Neither of them forgot how their story had begun. One evening, nearly a year after the merger, Ethan attended a conference focused on the future of global innovation. During a panel discussion, a moderator asked him a question that audiences frequently asked successful executives. What was the single most important factor behind long-term success? The room expected a familiar answer involving technology, investment, strategy, or ambition. Instead, Ethan paused for a moment before responding. He explained that intelligence matters, hard work matters, and vision matters. But none of those qualities can reach their full potential if they are blocked by ego. He said that some of the most valuable knowledge in the world exists in places people rarely think to look. Sometimes it sits across a conference table. Sometimes it works behind the scenes. Sometimes it wears a service uniform. The audience listened carefully as he continued. True leadership, he explained, begins the moment a person stops measuring others by appearances and starts recognizing their humanity. The answer received a standing ovation, but Ethan knew the credit did not belong entirely to him. It belonged to a lesson learned on an ordinary evening inside a restaurant where a billion-dollar merger almost disappeared because of arrogance and survived because of understanding. And if there was one truth he carried with him from that night forward, it was this. The most powerful person in the room is not always the loudest voice, the richest executive, or the individual sitting at the head of the table. More often than people realize, it is the person everyone else has overlooked.